official important conversation with attorney and businesswoman Kashmir from KBP Attorneys. Welcome, Kashmir.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
It is such a pleasure. To the audience today, we wanted to have Kashmir on board simply because it is inevitable as a couple when you are planning your wedding that you are ultimately dependent on so many different vendors to make your vision a reality. And I felt that it was befitting to address what the important points are for consideration as the couple embark on the planning journey and reach out to different vendors to try and make this a reality, and what the important points would be in including an attorney as part of planning their journey and guidance on specific matters. Now, before we dive in, I want to encourage our entire audience to please read the disclaimer that accompanies this video today. And I think it is important that what we are trying to say is this conversation, as important as it is, does not constitute or substitute for any of the legal advice that you need to seek directly with an attorney like Kashmir. And any of the views that are expressed by any one of our other vendors that are sharing this platform do not in any way relate to KBP Attorneys. Okay, so Kashmir, I think the first thing that I want to start with is that couples are very concerned with how it is that they hold vendors accountable. And I think that when this comes to mind, they want to understand a little bit about contracts. And I think the question that we have for you is that how do couples hold vendors accountable through means of a contract?
So I think just an introductory remark with regards to our contracts and agreements. In the wedding industry, we deal with various different types of vendors. So the first type we'd have is a very informal vendor who's usually a home industry. And the value of items that we often get from these vendors are smaller in monetary value. We then go up the scale, and the other type of vendors that we have are more our corporate vendors. So these are our larger vendors with a larger monetary value attached to their items. For example, your caterer, your wedding venue, as well as your photographer. So each of these vendors on the two sides of the scale would need a different type of agreement that would be entered into. For example, your smaller value items, such as your garlands, perhaps your turbans, perhaps a small tray of mithai, it is sufficient to enter into that agreement via WhatsApp or SMS or a quick meeting and a small invoice that's signed with a deposit that's paid. That is sufficient to safeguard a couple. Whereas if we move up the scale and we look at the higher value items, like the examples I've just given, our recommendation would be to enter into a proper written contract so that if you have to have a right of recourse thereafter, heaven forbid, but if the matter does have to go to small claims court, for example, you have a document that states your expectations, and it has to be the delivery or the lack thereof from your vendor, and that would be your source document, which you then have to go and remedy thereafter.
That makes complete sense to us. I feel that you were absolutely correct in saying that, you certainly get different scales of vendors within the industry. And I would recognize that it's certainly possible that not all vendors can contract in the same way. And I think by this, I mean that, you're not generally going to go to your tailor or sometimes the person that's making your cake with, a fully fledged contract. But help us understand, do things like WhatsApp messages and telephone calls suffice?
They do suffice in the negotiation of the agreement. And we're talking about here for your smaller valued items. But I would then recommend to make sure between the vendor and the couple that there are no misunderstandings. You can perhaps jot something down in a WhatsApp or on the receipt or the invoice that the vendor gives you, just to make sure that there is a meeting of minds with regards to what you are actually ordering from them. Because often with WhatsApps, it goes on for days and days, and you've got various messages back and forth, you've got various examples given. And as a couple, you want to make sure that there's no misunderstandings. So it should be your responsibility to then drop a final message to say, this is the date, this is the agreed time, these are my agreed colors, and this is the individual coming to pick up. This is the amount I've already paid for you. As a couple, you want to do everything you can to avoid a conflict on your day or after your day. So the ball will sit in your court to make sure that there's no misunderstandings. So how would you do that? Perhaps after a meeting with your vendor, you drop them a small email or an SMS to say, thanks so much. I'm happy that this is what we discussed, and these are the deliverables. If it's a small vendor, for example, a home industry, we would not necessarily assume that the individual or your tailor or the semi-retired uncle who's doing the turban or the auntie who's doing the garlands might not necessarily have sort of a document prepared. So it should sit with you, and it should be your responsibility to make sure that there's no misunderstandings. You put it in a small document or a small WhatsApp, and that should be your source document for the service that you are getting from that vendor.
I feel like that makes complete sense. It's not something which we need a particular sense of legislation to give us guidance on. I feel like this is sometimes a little bit of, general knowledge, a little bit of Absolutely. Being responsible when you engage with anyone, actually. I find,
at the end of the day, I think we want to, the idea is not let me make sure I have all my ducks in a row so that I can throw the Consumer Protection Act at the vendor, or so that if I have to then go to small claims court, I have all my documents. The idea is that you get what you want at your wedding or for your wedding week. So, the saying goes, you attract more, I think it's more bees with honey or something like that. And you want to always make sure that you have a good relationship with your vendors. So go the extra mile. Put something into a small concluding WhatsApp, concluding email, or concluding SMS, just to make sure that you know what's going on, and so does the vendor, as opposed to then threatening the vendor and saying, we're going to go to small claims court if X, Y, and Z is not done.
I 100% agree with you. I can say that, with every single vendor that I've come across, they are so passionate about what they do. And yes. I know that for a lot of them, they're not charging exorbitant fees to try and make up for, certain amount of profits. What they're doing is they're trying to cover costs and allocate a little bit of that profit towards the labor and their time. But I can agree with that. And I think that is why I absolutely advocate for, just being responsible about what our expectations are. And I think aligned to that, I can say that being in the industry, a lot of the expectations are being guided from social media, from Pinterest. Can we maybe dial down that road? We often get clients come to us with Pinterest pictures. And let's put ourselves maybe in the shoes of a person who's a baker, and somebody sends them a picture of a Pinterest cake that they liked, and maybe they wanted a few changes here and there. Help us understand, how do we navigate that to vendors? What is it that we need to do to make ourselves a little more clear so that we don't actually land up with, I think, a disappointed level of emotion on the day, and also so that we don't land up in small claims court?
Sure. So I think, the ideas and the brainstorming part of the contract should form, or of the agreement should form, part of your negotiation. So before you enter into a contract or an agreement with your vendor, before you pay any deposits, you need to make sure that your vendor can give you the item that you want. For example, if you choose a picture from Pinterest and it is a wedding cake and there are 100 handmade peonies stuck on that wedding cake, you need to have a conversation with your vendor to ensure that firstly, there's enough time for them to create that. And secondly, it would be useful to ask them for their own pictures as well, to make sure that they are able to deliver something similar to what you are expecting. And I think when you do that, there needs to be obviously a meeting of minds between you and the vendor. So what you might think, well, this is from Pinterest, and the vendor says, well, the middle layer of that cake is not even real. You need to make sure that you and the vendor have those discussions before deposits are paid, before agreements are concluded. It would not be a wise idea to start those discussions once you've entered into the agreement, and then the vendor says, look, there's not enough time for me to create 100 peonies. I can actually only do 20. Whereas in your mind, you wanted this gigantic wedding cake and now your expectations not being met, but you have already concluded an agreement with the vendor. So I think negotiations should be left for before a contract is concluded. You take through your reference pictures, but also ask the vendor for their own reference pictures for something similar that they've done. So you can reasonably see whether or not they can manage that work and whether their technique matches what you have in your mind.
That makes complete sense. I feel like if we had to summarize, this area of contracts, for me, it would seem that we need to understand who we're contracting with. It would seem to me that we also need to understand that certain vendors contract in different ways, and those different ways are also means that we hold them accountable by, and that specificity is important. So we need to be absolutely clear about what we need before we actually go and pay a deposit or pay that amount of money. Would I be correct in saying that?
Yes, I just want to add to your first point about who the individual is contracting with. Capacity in a contract is very important. So let me give you a small example. For example, the business is run by a mother and son. The son is the one that handles maybe the social media, the marketing, all the trendy items. And then he also meets with the client and discusses and brainstorms. Whereas the mom is the one that owns the business and she has the final say. When you as a couple have these conversations with the son, you need to make sure that the entire business is on board with your ideas, or the entire business has a meeting of minds for your expectations. For example, if it's a florist and the youngster is saying all the right things, yes, we can get these out of season flowers, we can import, we can get all these items for you. You sign the contract and a week later the mom says, look, my apologies, my son got too excited. I absolutely cannot import these. We absolutely cannot get these flowers that are out of season. And obviously now there's going to be animosity because now you've got to choose your second, third, or even fourth options. So when you discuss your contract, you need to make sure that your vendor or vendors have the right capacity. So whether you're speaking to the marketing manager or the manager of the entire venue or the company, we need to make sure that there's capacity. On the flip side of that, when you as a couple are negotiating your contracts with your vendors, the vendor needs to have a clear understanding of who the client is. Is it the parents? Is it the mom and dad? Is it the couple themselves? Sometimes there are examples where the mom and dad have their own set ideas and their own colors, and the vendor then quotes for those items. Whereas in the couple comes, for example, from a different province for a penultimate meeting and change the colors, change the ideas, and then the vendor's not really sure how that's going to now affect the quote. So I think from both parties, we need to make sure that there's sufficient capacity to enter into that contract for that specific wedding.
Definitely noted. And I hope our couples do as well.